When Lydia found strangers in her house with fake papers, they left behind one clue, a chip marked 412 that activated a network of reformed men bound by honor. What began as fraud became a community's fight for justice. Like, subscribe, and comment your location. The fluorescent hospital light still burned behind Lydia's eyelids as she turned onto Maple Street, her scrubs wrinkled from another 12-hour shift. The desert morning air carried the scent of sage and dust. But something else lingered. Fresh coffee grounds and the metallic tang of disturbed earth. Her breath caught. The front door hung open. Strangers moved through her living room with casual ownership, their voices carrying the kind of confidence that comes from believing the law is on your side. A man with salt and pepper hair directed others like he was conducting an orchestra of invasion. His accent carried urban sharpness that felt foreign against the backdrop of her grandmother's hand-sewn curtains. "Excuse me," Lydia's voice cracked. "This is my house." The man turned, his smile practiced and cold. "Was your house, ma'am? Foreclosure notice was posted 3 weeks ago. Bank's orders. I never received—" "Not my problem." He gestured to a woman cataloging Lydia's possessions. "We're inventorying assets. You'll need to collect personal items and vacate." Lydia's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages she'd missed while caring for patients who couldn't afford to wait. Nothing. No notices. No warnings. Just the quiet efficiency of bureaucracy dismantling her life. Across the street, Mrs. Chen peered through her kitchen window. 2 houses down, teenagers recorded everything on their phones, their whispered commentary carrying on the morning breeze. The mailman slowed his truck, craning his neck to witness the spectacle. "Mom," Maria appeared in the doorway, still in her school uniform, backpack sliding off her shoulder. At 16, she'd inherited Lydia's stubborn chin and her grandfather's fierce eyes, but now those eyes filled with the kind of confusion that comes when your foundation crumbles beneath your feet. "Go to Doña Estelle's house, mija," Lydia whispered, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. An officer approached, his uniform crisp in the morning heat. "Ma'am, you'll need to—" "I know what I need to do." Lydia's words carried the authority of someone who'd spent years making life and death decisions. "I just need 5 minutes." The officer's expression softened slightly. 5 minutes. Lydia moved through rooms that no longer belonged to her, each step echoing with the finality of goodbye. In her father's old study, she knelt before the small safe hidden behind his framed military commendations. Her fingers worked the combination. Maria's birthday, reversed, and the door swung open, empty, almost. A single piece of paper remained, yellowed with age, at the top, in her father's careful handwriting. 412, below it, a phone number and an address she recognized from childhood stories. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the debts we owe aren't about money, mija. They're about honor." The paper trembled in her hands as footsteps approached. The salt and pepper man appeared in the doorway, his impatience barely contained. "Time's up." Lydia folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her scrubs pocket next to her stethoscope. 2 lifelines from different worlds. As she walked past the strangers dismantling her life, she caught fragments of their conversation. Market value. Quick turnaround. Cash buyers from Phoenix. Outside, Doña Estelle waited with Maria, her weathered hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee that smelled like comfort and defiance. The old woman's eyes held stories that spanned decades, and something in her expression suggested she recognized the paper Lydia clutched. "Mi nieta," Doña Estelle murmured, using the affectionate term she'd called Lydia since childhood. "Some debts follow us through generations, but so do the people who remember." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the neighborhood where 3 generations of Lydia's family had built their lives. In her pocket, the number 412 felt heavier than any burden she'd carried through hospital corridors, more significant than any diagnosis she'd delivered. Maria's hand found hers, small fingers intertwining with larger ones that still bore the indent from her wedding ring, removed 3 years ago when David left for promises he found more attractive than the quiet dignity of desert life. "What do we do now, Mom?" Lydia looked at the house that had sheltered her father's dreams, her own ambitions, and her daughter's first steps. The strangers inside moved with the efficiency of locusts, but something in her father's final gift suggested they weren't the first people to underestimate the power of honor among those who remembered old promises. "We make a phone call," Lydia said, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through medical school. Single motherhood, and countless nights when hope felt as distant as rain in the desert. And we remind some people that 412 isn't just a number, it's a promise. Chapter 2. The library's air conditioning hummed like a mechanical lullaby as Maria spread photocopied documents across the scratched wooden table. Property records, local newspaper archives, and genealogy charts formed a puzzle she hoped would reveal why strangers could steal a house that had been in their family for 40 years. Meanwhile, Lydia sat in Doña Estel's kitchen, turning the yellowed paper between her fingers. The old woman moved with deliberate slowness, preparing café con leche the way she had when Lydia was Maria's age, and seeking refuge from her father's nightmares. "Your papa, he never talked about the old neighborhood," Doña Estelle said, settling into her chair with a sigh that carried decades of untold stories. "But some names, they stick in the memory like thorns." The phone number on the paper had a local prefix, but the address led to a part of town where strip malls and chain restaurants had buried the past under layers of urban sprawl. Lydia remembered her father's stories, fragments shared during late-night conversations when insomnia made him talkative and vulnerable. There had been a group, he'd said, men who'd lost their way but found each other, men who'd made promises when the world felt smaller and honor meant something that couldn't be legislated or regulated. The number 412 referred to their meeting place, apartment 412 in a building that no longer existed. "He saved someone's life once," Doña Estelle continued, her voice soft but certain. "A young man with a family. Your father? He took a bullet that was meant for someone else. Never talked about it. But the scar on his shoulder. I remember the scar." Lydia's voice caught. She'd asked about it once, as a child, and her father had simply said it was a reminder that some things are worth the cost. 3 miles across town, Mateo Rivera climbed down from his school bus, his maintenance uniform still smelling of industrial cleaner and honest work. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he hadn't seen in 15 years. 412, "Lydia Morales needs help today." The message sent ice through his veins and fire through his heart. He'd kept his word, stayed clean, built a life that his daughter could be proud of, but some promises transcend personal transformation. Back in the library, Maria discovered something interesting in a 1987 newspaper clipping. A fire at an apartment complex had left dozens homeless, but a group of residents had organized temporary shelter and fundraising with efficiency that impressed city officials. The article mentioned informal community leaders and men working to rebuild their lives. The address matched the one on her mother's paper. As the desert afternoon peaked, Lydia finally made the call. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, this is Lydia Morales, Miguel Morales' daughter." Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, 412, give me 2 hours." The line went dead, but the air around Lydia felt suddenly less empty. She looked out Doña Estelle's window toward the house where strangers continued their methodical dismantling of her life. But something had shifted. The isolation that had crushed her chest since dawn now felt like the quiet before a different kind of storm. "What happens now?" Maria asked when she arrived from the library, her research neatly organized in a manila folder. "Now we wait," Lydia said, but her voice carried a new quality, the sound of someone who'd remembered she wasn't alone in the world. Doña Estelle refilled their coffee cups and settled back into her chair. "Your father's friends," she said quietly. "They might look different now, older, grayer, carrying their own sorrows. But the men who remember 412, they don't forget debts, and they don't abandon family." The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang, then another, and another. The network was awakening. Chapter 3. They arrived at sunset like shadows gaining substance. 4 men whose faces carried the geography of hard years and harder choices. Mateo led them up Doña Estelle's front steps, his work boots careful on the cracked concrete. Behind him, a thin man with calloused hands and steady eyes, a broader figure whose gray beard couldn't hide the kindness around his mouth, and a younger man with the bearing of someone who'd learned authority through service rather than dominance. "Lydia," Mateo's voice held 30 years of unspoken gratitude. "Your father saved my life when I was 19 and stupid. Now his daughter needs help." The thin man stepped forward. "Carlos Mendez. I teach automotive repair at the community college now." His accent carried the cadence of someone who'd crossed many borders, geographical, social, and spiritual. "Your father helped me get clean, helped me get papers. I owe him everything." "Luis Aguilar," the bearded man added. "I run a small construction business. Miguel talked me out of some very bad decisions back when bad decisions felt like the only options available. The youngest introduced himself as David Chen, no relation to the neighbor, but Mrs. Chen's nephew who'd grown up hearing stories about the group that had helped his family during difficult times. They gathered around Doña Estel's kitchen table, and Maria served coffee while Lydia explained what had happened. The foreclosure documents, the strangers in her house, the bureaucratic maze that had trapped her family's security. "Show me the papers," Luis said, producing reading glasses that made him look more like a grandfather than whatever he'd been before Miguel Morales changed his trajectory. Carlos had already pulled out his phone. "I know someone at the county recorder's office, second shift clerk who's been there forever. If something's wrong with the documentation, she'll spot it." "What about the guys who took the house?" David asked. "You get any names? License plates?" Lydia described the salt and pepper man and his efficient crew. Luis frowned, exchanging glances with the others. "Sounds like the Phoenix operation," Mateo muttered. "They've been hitting neighborhoods all over the valley. Target houses where the paperwork's complicated or the owners don't have lawyers." "Your father ever mention anything about keeping documents somewhere safe?" Carlos asked. "These guys are smart. They know which houses to hit. Usually means they've got inside information." Lydia thought about her father's study. The safe, the mysterious absence of papers that should have been there. Everything was gone except this. She placed the 412 note on the table. Doña Estel leaned forward. Miguel was careful, paranoid even. If papers are missing, he hid them somewhere these wolves wouldn't think to look. Luis stood, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "We're going to need to move fast. These operations rely on speed. Get in, establish possession, make it expensive and complicated to fight back. But if we can prove fraud, Carlos and I'll start with the documentation angle," David said. "Luis, you and Mateo check the physical evidence. Look for anything that doesn't add up." Maria spoke up from her spot by the counter. "I've been researching at the library. There's a pattern with these foreclosures. Houses that should have been paid off, families with good credit histories, always targeting single mothers or elderly people. Smart girl," Luis smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud," as the men prepared to leave. Carlos paused at the door. 412 was about second chances, he said quietly. "Your father believed that people could change, that debts of honor mattered more than legal documents. We're going to prove him right." Through the kitchen window, they could see lights still burning in Lydia's house. The strangers showed no signs of leaving, but their confidence had created a blind spot. They'd assumed Lydia was powerless. A single mother, a nurse working impossible hours, someone without connections or resources. They'd never considered that 30 years ago, a man named Miguel Morales had invested in people rather than property, that those investments had grown into a network of reformed lives. Second chances, and unbreakable loyalty. "What do we do while we wait?" Lydia asked. Mateo smiled, and for a moment the weight of years lifted from his shoulders. "We remember that 412 isn't just about the past. It's about family, and family doesn't abandon family." Outside, the desert night wrapped around the neighborhood like a protective blanket. In her stolen house, Lydia could see strangers moving behind her father's curtains. But here, surrounded by people who owed her father their lives, she felt something she hadn't experienced since his death, the certainty that she wasn't fighting alone. Chapter 4. The county clerk's office smelled like old paper and broken dreams. Fluorescent lights humming over rows of filing cabinets that held the bureaucratic bones of countless lives. Carlos's contact, a woman named Rosa, who wore her gray hair in a tight bun, and her skepticism like armor, spread the foreclosure documents across her desk. She murmured, running a finger down columns of numbers. "Timeline's tight. Foreclosure notice filed on a Friday, executed the following Monday. That's unusual. Bank usually wants 30 days minimum to cover their legal exposure." "What else?" Carlos leaned forward, his phone ready to record whatever she discovered. "Signature on the original mortgage modification." Rosa held the paper up to the light. "See how the ink's different. This was signed with a different pen than the initial application, and the pressure points." She traced the letters with a practiced eye. Someone was copying a signature, not writing their own name. Meanwhile, across town, Luis and Mateo walked through Lydia's neighborhood with the methodical precision of men accustomed to analyzing structural problems. They knocked on doors, asked questions, listened to stories that painted a picture of systematic targeting. Mrs. Patterson from the Blue House had received strange phone calls asking about her mortgage payments. The Hernandez family had been approached by a man offering to help with their financial situation, just days before their foreclosure notice appeared. Always the same pattern: vulnerable people, complicated paperwork, promises of help that became snares. "It's not random," Luis said as they regrouped at Doña Estel's house. "Someone's feeding them information. Property records, family situations, financial status. This is organized." At the library, Maria had expanded her research beyond property records into local business licenses and corporate filings. Her spreadsheet revealed connections that would have made a detective proud: shell companies with similar addresses, incorporation dates clustered around major foreclosure waves, and a web of LLCs that all led back to a single Phoenix law firm. David had taken a different approach, one that would have worried his parole officer 15 years ago. He'd positioned himself across from Lydia's house and watched. The salt and pepper man came and went on a schedule, always checking his phone, always speaking to the same people. Professional operation. But professionals made patterns, and patterns could be broken. The breakthrough came at dusk when Rosa called Carlos with news that made him punch the air in victory. "The notary stamp on the foreclosure documents," she said, her voice tight with anger. "It's fake. Real stamp has a different serial number, and I know the woman whose name is on there. She's been in Mexico for 6 months visiting her sick mother. Someone forged her seal." Luis hung up his phone and turned to the group. "That's not all. I talked to my friend at the building department. No permits pulled for the work they're doing in there, but they've been removing walls and renovating since this morning, trying to establish improvements to claim sweat equity. Squatters' rights with a business plan," Mateo growled. Lydia felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. "They're not just stealing the house. They're stealing it professionally." Doña Estel had been quiet through most of the discussion, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who'd survived decades of neighborhood politics and bureaucratic warfare. "In the old days, before your father found these men," she said, gesturing toward the group, "problems like this were solved differently, but Miguel taught them that the law could be a tool, not an enemy. That patience and evidence matter more than anger and impulse." Carlos held up his phone. "Rosa's willing to testify about the forged documents. Says she's tired of watching families get robbed by people in expensive suits. I've got 3 neighbors willing to describe the same suspicious approach," Luis added. "And I've got corporate records that show this isn't their first time," Maria said, her research organized with the precision of someone who'd inherited her mother's attention to detail. "Evidence is good," David said quietly, "but we need leverage. These people are smart. They'll disappear the moment they think they're caught. We need to corner them before they know what's happening." The kitchen fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on the interstate and the hum of Doña Estel's ancient refrigerator. Outside, lights still burned in Lydia's house, but now those lights felt less like violation and more like a countdown timer. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked. David smiled, and the expression transformed his face from careful neutrality to something that suggested he'd learned useful skills during his years of bad decisions. "I'm thinking," he said, "that it's time to turn hunters into prey." Chapter 5. Word traveled through the neighborhood like smoke on desert wind. By the 3rd day, Lydia's front yard had transformed from a crime scene into a gathering place. Folding chairs appeared from unknown sources, and someone had set up a card table where neighbors took turns maintaining a visible presence. Mrs. Chen brought thermoses of coffee and her signature determination. The Hernandez family contributed homemade tamales and stories about their own close call with foreclosure sharks. Even teenagers who normally treated adult problems with studied indifference began drifting by after school, their phones capturing everything with the casual vigilance of a generation raised on social media justice. The salt and pepper man, who'd introduced himself to city officials as Robert Sterling, found his smooth operation suddenly operating under constant observation. Every time he entered or left the house, someone was watching. Every delivery truck, every conversation, every bureaucratic meeting was documented by people who'd learned that sunlight was often the best disinfectant. Luis had organized the vigil with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing construction crews. Shifts rotated every 4 hours, ensuring continuous presence without overwhelming any single family. Carlos contributed technical expertise, setting up a simple security camera that live-streamed to a private YouTube channel. "They're getting nervous," David reported during the evening briefing at Doña Estel's house. Sterling made 3 phone calls while standing in the driveway today. All of them heated conversations where he kept saying this wasn't part of the plan. Maria looked up from her laptop, where she'd been monitoring local news outlets and social media. The stories spreading, local news picked up the live stream, And people are sharing it. Comments are mostly supportive, but there are some that sound like threats. Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. Success was creating new dangers, a tension that could protect them or expose them to retaliation from people whose business model required operating in shadows. What kind of threats? Luis asked, his voice carrying the edge of someone prepared to take protective action. Anonymous accounts posting about troublemakers and people who don't know their place. One mentioned specific addresses. Maria's voice was steady, but Lydia could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. Mateo stood, his jaw set. We need to expand the circle. More eyes, more witnesses, more people who care about what happens here. Carlos nodded. I'll call my students. Some of them are good kids who could use a lesson in civic responsibility. Others are kids who remember what it feels like to be powerless. Community meeting, Doña Estelle suggested. Saturday afternoon at the church. Father Martinez has been asking about all the activity. He's interested in hearing the full story. That night, as Lydia walked through the neighborhood that had become her support system, she noticed changes that went beyond the vigil. Porch lights stayed on later. Neighbors lingered in front yards, finding excuses to water plants or check mailboxes. Children played in groups that included families who'd rarely spoken before. Crisis had revealed something that had always existed beneath the surface. The quiet bonds of people who shared geography and values, who understood that what happened to one family could happen to any family. Mom. Maria matched her pace, their footsteps soft on the still warm asphalt. Are you scared? Lydia considered the question honestly. Fear was present, for her daughter's safety, for the possibility that fighting back might make things worse, for the chance that her father's faith in 412 might not be enough against modern predators with corporate lawyers and political connections. But stronger than fear was something else, the bone-deep certainty that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. Her father had faced worse situations with fewer resources and had somehow managed to build a network of loyalty that transcended decades. Yes, she told her daughter, but I'm more angry than scared, and anger, channeled properly, can be very useful. Above them, stars appeared in the desert sky, with the clarity that only comes when city lights are sparse and air pollution minimal. The same stars that had witnessed her father's struggles, his choices, his quiet investments in human dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Sterling's legal responses, media attention that could cut both ways, and the complex process of translating evidence into justice. But tonight, surrounded by neighbors who'd chosen solidarity over self-interest, Lydia felt something her father would have recognized. The patient strength of people who understood that protecting home meant protecting each other. Chapter 6. The Phoenix law firm's offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that reflected the desert sun like a mirror designed to blind truth seekers. Luis and Carlos sat in the parking garage, watching lawyers and paralegals move with the urgent efficiency of people billing by the minute. 3rd floor, Carlos murmured, checking his phone against the directory they'd photographed. Castillo, Morrison and Associates, foreclosure specialists. Inside the building, they'd convinced the security guard that they were contractors bidding on renovation work, a lie that felt comfortable given their actual expertise in construction and repair. The elevator rode smooth and silent, delivering them to a floor where expensive carpeting muffled the sound of moral compromise. The receptionist barely glanced up as they walked past, their work clothes and confident bearing suggesting they belonged. Carlos had learned during his years of bad decisions that looking like you belonged was often enough to gain access to places that should have been protected, while they gathered intelligence in Phoenix. Maria had transformed Doña Estelle's kitchen into a research command center. Bank records, credit reports, property assessments, and phone logs covered every available surface. Her laptop screen showed multiple browser tabs, court filing databases, news archives, and social media profiles that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. Sterling's real name is Robert Castellanos, she announced as Lydia and Mateo returned from their shift at the vigil. Changed it legally 3 years ago, right around the time he incorporated his first shell company. Before that, he was a mortgage broker who lost his license for document fraud. Doña Estelle looked up from her coffee. Same leopard, new spots. David had spent the day following a different kind of paper trail, the physical evidence left behind by people who believed they were untouchable. Dumpster diving behind the law firm had yielded shredded documents that, when carefully taped together, revealed communications between Castellanos and his Phoenix handlers. They've got a quota system, he reported, spreading reconstructed pages across the table. minimum 15 properties per quarter, with bonuses for high-value targets and quick turnarounds. Your house was worth extra points because of the corner lot and development potential. Lydia stared at the fragments that reduced her family's security to a game played by people who would never wonder where their next meal was coming from. How many others? Based on these notes, at least 40 families in the past year, just in this county. Luis called from Phoenix, with an update that made everyone lean closer to the phone. Security cameras here caught something interesting yesterday. Castellanos met with someone from the county assessor's office. Off-site, cash payment, envelope exchange. Carlos got photos. The photos showed a tired-looking woman in a county ID badge accepting what appeared to be payment for information, property records, assessment schedules, family situation reports, the kind of inside intelligence that would make foreclosure fraud significantly easier. We've got them, Mateo said quietly. Document forgery, insider information, systematic fraud. Question is, how do we use it without tipping them off? Maria had been thinking about the same problem. Local news has been asking for interviews. What if we give them something bigger than just our story? What if we give them a scandal? The adults exchanged glances. Media attention was a double-edged sword. It could force official action, but it could also prompt the criminals to disappear before justice could be served. Timing matters, David said. We need everything coordinated. Legal filing, media release, law enforcement notification, all at the same time, so they can't run or destroy evidence. Carlos's voice came through the phone speaker with barely contained excitement. Rosa at the county clerk's office has been documenting irregularities for months. Says if we can provide the missing pieces, she's got enough to trigger a federal investigation into county corruption. How long do we need? Lydia asked. 2 days to organize everything, Luis replied. Monday morning, we hit them from every direction at once. That evening, as the vigil settled into its nighttime routine of quiet voices and persistent presence, Lydia walked through her neighborhood with new eyes. Each porch light represented a family that could be targeted. Each elderly resident, each single parent, each recent immigrant was a potential victim of people who viewed vulnerable communities as profit opportunities. But they were also witnesses, allies, people who understood that justice delayed was often justice denied. The network her father had built through 412 had grown into something larger, a community that remembered how to protect itself. 2 more days, she whispered, looking toward the house where strangers still moved behind her father's curtains. 2 more days to prove that some debts are paid in courtrooms rather than back alleys, and that the bonds between people who choose honor over expediency can be stronger than corporate greed. Chapter 7. The community center filled with the rustling energy of people who'd arrived carrying folding chairs and personal stakes in the outcome. Father Martinez had opened the church hall on Saturday morning, and by 10 o'clock, the space overflowed with neighbors, supporters, and media representatives whose cameras captured everything with the hungry efficiency of truth-seekers scenting scandal. Lydia stood at the front of the room, Rosa's documentation spread across a borrowed table. Beside her, Luis held a laptop connected to a projector that would display the evidence they'd gathered with the methodical precision of people who understood that facts mattered more than feelings. Most of you know why we're here, Lydia began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. But some of you might not know how deep this goes, or how many families have been hurt by the same people who tried to steal my father's house. Maria operated the laptop, clicking through slides that told the story in devastating detail. Property records showing impossible timelines, forged signatures that could be verified by handwriting experts, financial flows between shell companies that existed only to obscure money trails. This isn't about one family, Carlos added, standing beside the evidence table. This is about systematic targeting of our community, people who work hard, pay their bills, and trust that the law protects honest families. Castellanos arrived halfway through the presentation, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the work clothes and modest dresses of the community members. He brought 2 men in similar suits, lawyers probably, or security contractors hired to intimidate witnesses. Excuse me, he interrupted, his voice carrying practiced authority. I have legal documentation that proves. We know about your documentation, David said quietly from his position near the back of the room. His tone was conversational, but something in his posture suggested he was prepared for trouble. We also know about your meeting with Sandra Valdez from the county assessor's office, and your incorporation papers, and the other 43 families you've targeted this year. The room went silent, except for the hum of the projector and the soft click of camera shutters. Castellanos's confident expression flickered like a light bulb losing power. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "But property law is complex and—" "Property law is simple," Father Martinez interjected from his seat in the front row. "Thou shalt not steal. Even I know that one." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, but the underlying tension remained thick enough to cut with a blade. Lydia looked at the man who'd tried to steal her father's legacy and saw something she recognized from her years in medical practice. The moment when someone realized that their condition was more serious than they'd wanted to believe. "Monday morning," Luis announced, "we're filing complaints with the district attorney's office, the state attorney general, and the FBI's white-collar crime division. We're also providing evidence to a federal task force investigating mortgage fraud in multiple states. Additionally," Rosa added, stepping forward with documentation that represented months of careful record-keeping, "the county is launching an internal investigation into information security breaches and employee misconduct. Several people are going to have very serious conversations with federal investigators." Castellanos looked around the room as if seeing it clearly for the first time. These weren't powerless victims who would disappear quietly when threatened. These were organized, determined people who understood that sunlight was the best disinfectant and that collective action was more powerful than individual intimidation. "This is harassment," he said finally. "Legal harassment designed to interfere with legitimate business operations." "No," Lydia replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years making decisions under pressure. "This is community self-defense. This is what happens when you underestimate people who have something worth protecting." The meeting continued for another hour, but the decisive moment had already passed. Castellanos and his associates left before the formal conclusion. Their hasty departure captured by multiple cameras and uploaded to social media before they reached their cars. Later, as volunteers cleaned the community center and neighbors discussed coordination for the coming week, Lydia stood outside watching the desert sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold that reminded her of her father's favorite evening walks. Mariah joined her, along with the members of Forward 12, who'd become family through shared purpose, rather than shared blood. "Think they'll run?" Mateo asked. "Probably," David replied. "But running won't help now. Too many people know their names, their methods, their connections. They're finished in this business." "What about the others?" Lydia asked. "The families they've already hurt," Carlos smiled. "That's next week's project. Rosa thinks we can reverse at least half the fraudulent foreclosures if we move quickly enough." As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lydia felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the peaceful certainty that comes from knowing you fought for something larger than personal interest. The house where strangers had moved was still occupied, but it no longer felt stolen. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and legal procedures, but tonight brought the satisfaction of work well done by people who remembered that some battles are worth fighting regardless of personal cost. Chapter 8. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of desert winter, and by 8 o'clock, Lydia stood outside the county courthouse holding documents that represented 3 weeks of community investigation and 30 years of delayed justice. Luis carried a banker's box filled with evidence, while Carlos managed media interviews with the calm professionalism of someone who'd learned that truth was more powerful than anger. The district attorney's office had opened early to accommodate the flood of documentation. Assistant Day Jennifer Wong reviewed the forgery evidence with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent years building cases against people who believed expensive lawyers were better than honest facts. "Fraud charges are straightforward," she told Lydia during a conference that included Rosa and Father Martinez as community witnesses. "Document forgery, conspiracy, theft by deception. We can make those stick. The corruption charges will take longer, but we have cooperation from federal investigators." Meanwhile, 3 miles across town, Castellanos discovered that success in business required staying ahead of consequences. By the time police arrived with search warrants for his office and temporary residence, he'd already loaded important documents into his Range Rover and activated disappearance plans that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement. But criminal sophistication couldn't overcome community determination. David and Mateo had maintained surveillance throughout the weekend, and their photographs of license plates and associate meetings provided tracking information that made hiding significantly more difficult. "He's heading toward the interstate," David reported by phone. "But I don't think he's running. Looks more like he's trying to retrieve something before he disappears." The something turned out to be a storage unit containing documents from previous operations, client lists, forged paperwork templates, and communication records that painted a picture of systematic exploitation, spanning multiple states and hundreds of families. By afternoon, Lydia found herself standing in her father's house for the first time in 3 weeks. The court-ordered removal of Castellanos' associates had been executed with police efficiency, but the space felt hollow, damaged by strangers who'd treated her family's history as inventory to be catalogued and discarded. Maria walked through rooms that had been altered by people who understood property values, but nothing about the weight of memories. Walls had been removed, floors refinished, and fixtures replaced with the generic efficiency of house flippers, who viewed homes as profit opportunities rather than repositories of accumulated love. "It's going to take work," Luis observed, running his hands along walls where load-bearing supports had been compromised. "They didn't just steal, they damaged, but it's structurally sound. We can fix what they broke." Doña Estelle arrived with cleaning supplies and the determined expression of someone who'd spent decades making damaged things whole again. Behind her came neighbors carrying tools, paint, and the collective energy of people who understood that restoration was about more than repairing physical damage. "Community work day is Saturday," Carlos announced. "Everyone brings what they can contribute: skills, materials, labor, food. We'll have your home ready for living by Sunday evening." That night, as Lydia and Maria stayed in their house for the first time since the invasion, sounds that had once been familiar felt foreign. Floorboards creaked differently where supports had been altered. Windows rattled where weather stripping had been removed. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed changed, as if appliances remembered the touch of strangers, but deeper sounds remained constant. The distant whisper of interstate traffic, the settle of foundations settling into desert soil, the soft whistle of wind through sage and mesquite that surrounded their neighborhood like protective barriers. "Are you okay?" Maria asked from her old bedroom, which still smelled faintly of the industrial cleaning products Castellanos' crew had used to erase traces of their occupancy. "Getting there," Lydia replied honestly. "It's still home. Just needs time to remember who belongs here." Outside, porch lights glowed in houses where neighbors had organized schedule rotations to maintain security until life returned to normal rhythms. The vigil had ended, but the connections it had created remained. Phone numbers exchanged, childcare arrangements established, and the quiet bonds of people who'd discovered that protecting community meant protecting each other. In her father's study, Lydia carefully hung the framed 412 note above the empty safe. The number had opened doors she'd never known existed, had connected her to people whose loyalty transcended decades, and whose commitment to honor had proven stronger than criminal conspiracy. But more importantly, it had reminded her that some inheritances couldn't be stolen. The values that created community, the courage that confronted injustice, and the understanding that debt of gratitude was a legacy worth passing on to the next generation. Chapter 9. Saturday arrived with the kind of desert morning that made work feel like celebration. By 7 o'clock, Lydia's front yard had transformed into a staging area for organized reconstruction, with volunteers arriving in pickup trucks loaded with lumber, paint, tools, and industrial-sized coolers filled with food that would sustain a small army. Luis had spent the week developing a work plan that would maximize efficiency while ensuring everyone could contribute meaningfully. Skilled trades workers tackled structural repairs, while teenagers and retirees handled painting, landscaping, and the countless detail tasks that transformed a house from damaged property into a home. "Wall support goes in first," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. "Then electrical, plumbing, and finish work. Paint crew starts with exterior while we're working inside. Food service maintains itself. Everyone eats when they're hungry." Maria had organized a childcare station under the shade of Doña Estelle's backyard ramada, where neighborhood children could participate without interfering with power tools and construction debris. She'd also established a social media command center, documenting the restoration process with photographs and video that told a story larger than home repair. Carlos arrived with 6 students from his automotive program, young men and women who understood the dignity of skilled work and the satisfaction of fixing things that had been deliberately broken. They'd brought sophisticated tools, and the enthusiasm of people proving that technical education created competence that couldn't be purchased or faked. "My grandfather always said," one of them explained to Lydia while installing new weather stripping, "that criminals can break things quickly, but building them back better takes time and people who care about quality." Mateo coordinated the volunteer schedule with the efficiency of someone who'd learned project management through necessity rather than business school. Every hour brought new arrivals, families from other neighborhoods who'd heard about the story, church groups contributing labor and materials, and individual volunteers whose personal experiences with fraud or displacement had motivated them to act. The work progressed with the steady rhythm of competent people who understood that restoration required patience as much as skill. Walls were repaired, floors refinished, and damaged fixtures replaced with quality materials that would outlast the shortcuts Castellanos' crew had installed. But the real transformation was less visible. The way neighbors who'd rarely spoken before discovered shared interests in gardening, home improvement, and community organization. The way teenagers learned that adults could be allies rather than obstacles. The way elderly residents shared practical knowledge with younger families who were building lives in the same places where their teachers had already succeeded. "This is how it used to be," Doña Estelle observed during the lunch break. Watching families from multiple generations work side by side. Before everyone got busy and scared, when neighbors were family you chose rather than strangers you tolerated. David had taken responsibility for security coordination, ensuring that the celebration didn't become a target for people who might view community organization as a threat, but his vigilance felt protective rather than paranoid, the careful attention of someone who'd learned that prevention was easier than repair. As afternoon heat peaked, the work moved indoors and into shaded areas. Interior painting, cabinet installation, and detail finish work that required concentration rather than physical strength. Maria taught neighborhood children how to organize tools and materials, passing on the kind of practical knowledge that schools rarely included in their curricula. "Why did the bad men take your house?" a 7-year-old asked with the directness that only children could manage. "Because they thought we couldn't stop them," Maria replied. "But they were wrong. When people work together, we're stronger than anyone who tries to hurt us." By evening, the house had been transformed from crime scene to home. Fresh paint, repaired walls, restored function, and the kind of attention to detail that suggested love rather than expedience. But more importantly, the process had transformed a neighborhood from a collection of individual properties into a community that understood its own strength. As volunteers packed tools and shared final conversations, Lydia walked through rooms that felt familiar again. The stranger's damage had been erased, but more than that, improvements had been made that enhanced rather than compromised her father's original vision. In the kitchen, where appliances hummed with reliable efficiency, she found the framed 412 note surrounded by business cards, phone numbers, and contact information for dozens of people who'd become part of her extended family through shared work rather than shared blood. Tomorrow would bring the quiet satisfaction of normal life, but tonight brought the exhausted peace of people who'd discovered that building community was harder than building walls, but infinitely more rewarding. Chapter 10. Sunday afternoon brought the kind of desert peace that made celebration feel like prayer. Long tables stretched across Lydia's backyard, laden with dishes that represented the cultural geography of a neighborhood, where Mexican grandmothers shared recipes with Korean immigrants, and where teenage expertise with smartphones complemented elderly wisdom about desert gardening. The house behind them stood restored, not just repaired, but improved by the collective attention of people who understood that home meant more than shelter. Fresh paint gleamed in the afternoon light. New windows provided better insulation against desert extremes, and the structural repairs had been executed with the kind of quality that would protect future generations. But the real achievement was less visible. The transformation of a neighborhood from a collection of individual properties into a community that had discovered its own capacity for protection, organization, and collective action. "Salud," Father Martinez called out, raising his glass of horchata as the assembled families settled around tables that had been arranged with the casual precision of people accustomed to large gatherings. To neighbors who become family, and to families who remember that strength comes from standing together. The toast was echoed in multiple languages, followed by the comfortable sounds of a community meal, silverware on plates, conversations that spanned generations, and the laughter of children whose parents had learned that civic engagement was a form of love that could be modeled rather than merely discussed. Lydia found herself seated between Doña Estelle and Rosa, surrounded by people whose lives had intersected through crisis and been strengthened through shared purpose. Across the table, Luis described construction projects that would provide apprenticeships for Carlos's students. Maria and David discussed social media strategies for documenting and preventing similar fraud schemes. "What happens next?" someone asked as dessert plates were cleared. and the afternoon light began its slow slide toward evening. Next, we help other families, Mateo replied. 43 fraudulent foreclosures means 42 families still need justice. Rosa has the documentation, Carlos has the legal contacts, and we have the experience. Community organization becomes permanent, Luis added. Monthly meetings, communication networks, neighborhood watch programs that go beyond crime prevention to include fraud protection and civic engagement. The 412 network had evolved into something larger than its original purpose. What had begun as a promise between reformed men had grown into a community resource that connected multiple generations and ethnic groups around shared values rather than shared histories. As evening approached and families began the gradual process of departure, Lydia walked through her house one final time. In her father's study, the framed 412 note occupied a place of honor above the restored safe, but it was no longer the only reminder of inherited obligation. Business cards, volunteer schedules, and contact lists covered the desk surface, evidence of a community that had discovered its own capacity for protection and mutual aid. The debt of honor that had brought Mateo, Carlos, Luis, and David to her rescue had been paid, but it had also generated new obligations that would continue indefinitely. Maria found her standing in the doorway, both of them looking at the room where their family's crisis had become their neighborhood's opportunity for transformation. "Are you happy?" Maria asked, using the tone that suggested she was processing emotions too complex for simple categories. Lydia considered the question with the care it deserved. The past month had brought violation, fear, uncertainty, and the kind of stress that aged people prematurely. But it had also brought discovery of community resources, personal strength, and the kind of connections that made vulnerable families less vulnerable. "I'm grateful," she said finally. "Grateful for your grandfather's friends, for neighbors who became family, for the chance to learn that we're stronger together than any of us imagined we could be alone." Outside, porch lights began appearing in houses where families had established new routines for communication and mutual support. The vigil had ended, but the vigilance had become permanent. Not the suspicious attention of people who feared their neighbors, but the loving attention of people who understood that protecting community meant protecting each other. The desert evening wrapped around their neighborhood with the familiar comfort of geography that had been claimed by people who belonged there. Above them, stars appeared with the clarity that only came when artificial light was minimal, and the air was clean enough to reveal the full scope of possibility. How do you think communities can best support families facing financial fraud? What role should neighbors play in protecting each other from predatory practices? Would you like another story?